If you can't keep up, Walter, we'll have to let you go. The young manager's voice cut through the break room as the team fell silent. Walter Bennett, the elderly electrician, said nothing. He quietly removed his gloves, set his locker key and ID badge on the table, and walked out without a word. But just 2 weeks later, as a brutal storm plunged the entire city into darkness, the mayor herself stood at Walter's doorstep. Soaked by rain, her hands trembled as she held out a bundle of yellowed blueprints. Why had an entire city come crawling back to the man they had cast aside? And could he still save them? Walter Bennett was a man whose life was measured not in titles or accolades, but in the quiet, invisible thread of service that held a city together. For 3 decades, Walter was the backbone of Crestwood's electrical grid, the man you called when the storm hit, when the lights flickered and died, when hospital generators kicked in, and mothers lit candles by the window. In neighborhoods across the city, people might not have known his name, but they knew his work. It was Walter who had kept them safe, warm, and connected when the world went dark. He started as a lanky young apprentice back in the late 1970s, when the tools were heavy, the risks were high, and the rules were often learned the hard way. Walter was mentored by a generation of old-timers who measured a man's worth by the dirt under his fingernails and the calm in his voice when everything was going wrong. They showed him the art of reading circuits by ear, feeling for vibrations in the walls, and sensing trouble where machines couldn't detect it. Walter soaked it all in the long hours, the near misses, the ingenious workarounds that kept the city's patched-up systems alive. Over the years, he became the go-to man. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, Walter had seen it all. There was the blizzard of '93 when power lines snapped under ice, and Walter led crews through hip-deep snow to reconnect neighborhoods. There was the summer storm in 2006 that brought down the transmission tower near the hospital. Walter was the one who stayed until dawn, sweating under the July sun to restore power to the ICU. And who could forget the Christmas Eve blackout when a transformer fire threatened to shut down the entire downtown? Walter worked through the night, bypassing circuits and coaxing the system back to life just as the church bells rang on Christmas morning. His hands carried the marks of that life, knuckles thickened scars, crossing his palms like a roadmap of battles fought underground. His knees ached from decades of climbing ladders and crouching in tight utility spaces. And yet, through it all, Walter's mind remained sharp as ever. What set Walter apart wasn't just his skill, it was his memory. Over time, Crestwood's electrical grid had evolved into a messy patchwork of upgrades, emergency fixes, and undocumented changes. But Walter carried it all in his head, every junction box installed in a hurry, every switch rerouted to dodge a blown fuse, every shortcut no blueprint could show. He joked, "Sometimes I've got Google Maps in my brain, but for wires." But the truth was, Walter's knowledge wasn't something an app could replace. It was hard-won wisdom, passed from hand to hand, learned in the field and remembered long after the manuals were outdated. In an age racing toward automation, Walter was the last of his kind, the keeper of a city's hidden heartbeat. Then came Eric Cruz. Eric swept into Crestwood like a brisk autumn wind, young, sharp, and full of vision. Fresh from business school, armed with an MBA and a polished resume, Eric arrived with one mission: drag Crestwood into the future. Where Walter saw a city built on sweat and memory, Eric saw a city lagging behind, desperate for innovation. Eric's first day at the utilities department was unforgettable. He strode through the glass doors in a crisp suit, smartphone in hand, talking about smart grids, real-time analytics, and efficiency over tradition. Within weeks, he introduced dashboards, efficiency metrics, and AI-driven predictive models. Paper logs were tossed in storage closets. Old meters were ripped out and replaced with sleek, new devices, and tablets appeared in the hands of every technician. "We're building a city for the future," Eric proudly declared at every meeting, smiling as if he were unveiling a masterpiece. For Walter, it was the start of a quiet, slow-burning war. At first, Walter tried, he really did. He sat through the mandatory training sessions, squinting at the glowing slides through his scratched reading glasses. He filled a thick spiral notebook with handwritten notes, trying to capture the pace of the new systems. He tapped at the tablets with broad, calloused fingers, his movements slow and hesitant. His younger colleagues, people like Diego Morales, eager and talented, respected Walter deeply. They admired the man, even if they sometimes chuckled when he muttered under his breath, "I'd fix this faster with a voltmeter and a pencil." But where the younger crew adapted in days, Walter was left in the dust. The AI dashboards, the automated reports, the touchscreens designed for nimble fingers, they weren't built for a man who'd spent his life with wrenches and wire cutters. Walter's pace was steady, deliberate, and unshakable, but it was no match for the app-driven world Eric was building. Eric, meanwhile, saw Walter not as a treasure, but as a burden. To him, Walter was a symbol of a bygone era, the analog past holding back the digital future. "You've served the city well," Eric said one afternoon, his tone polished but cold. He barely looked up from his laptop, "But we need people who can keep up with the pace of change." Walter didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or plead his case. Instead, he gave a quiet nod, the same calm nod he'd given 100 times over the years when walking into an outage or a down line. The next morning, Walter came in early. He folded his gloves with care, set his ID badge and locker key on the dispatch desk, and walked out of the building with his back straight, his head high, and not a single word of complaint. The department fell silent, and with that, Crestwood's past quietly slipped out the door, just as the future rushed in. Walter Bennett's retirement was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no grand farewell party, no gold watch, no speech in his honor, just a few firm handshakes, some murmured thank yous, and a hallway of coworkers who looked away as he passed for the last time. For a man who had spent 3 decades keeping Crestwood's lights on, his exit was as unceremonious as flipping a switch. At first, Walter welcomed the stillness. For years, his days had been filled with clanging tools, buzzing radios, and the endless hum of generators. Now mornings began with coffee on his back porch, the cool breeze rustling the old oak tree in his yard. His small bungalow perched on the edge of town became his sanctuary. There was a tidy garden, a weathered workbench in the shed, and shelves lined with manuals and hand-drawn diagrams, relics of a life defined by work. But as the weeks passed, something in Walter began to stir, like an engine left idling too long. Without the pre-dawn calls from dispatch, the urgent knock on his door during storms, or the familiar crackle of his work radio, the days stretched long and empty. He found himself pacing the house, organizing tools he no longer needed, flipping through old notebooks filled with sketches of circuits and handwritten notes. The town, meanwhile, moved on. Crestwood embraced its new smart grid with enthusiasm. Articles appeared in the local paper praising Eric Cruz's leadership, celebrating the city's transformation into a model of efficiency. Tablets replaced clipboards, automated systems tracked outages, and younger techs confidently navigated the digital landscape. Walter, once the go-to man in every crisis, became a fading name in an HR file. Every so often, a neighbor would stop by. "Hey, Walter, how's retirement?" they'd ask, smiling politely. "Quiet," Walter would say, forcing a smile of his own. On rare days, young Ethan Parker from next door would wander over, skateboard in hand, peppering Walter with questions. "Did you really keep the whole city running?" Ethan asked one afternoon. Eyes wide with curiosity, I helped, Walter replied with a soft chuckle. When it mattered, but Ethan, raised in a world of Google and YouTube, was skeptical. A few days later, he returned and said, "I tried looking you up online." "There's nothing there," Walter smiled faintly. "Not everything important shows up online, son." Despite the outward calm, the remark lingered with Walter. That evening, alone in his kitchen, he booted up his old computer, the same one he'd used for years to check weather reports and submit handwritten logs. He typed his name into the search bar. A few scattered mentions popped up: a commendation from 2004, a faded photo from a departmental picnic, a brief line, and a retirement announcement. That was it. 30 years of service, 3 decades of storms, weathered crises averted and lives protected, and barely a trace remained. Walter leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. For the first time in a long while, the man who had always known where every wire led wondered quietly where his own path had gone. It began as an ordinary autumn storm, dark clouds rolling in over Crestwood, a steady drizzle on the sidewalks, and the soft rumble of distant thunder. But by nightfall, the ordinary became anything but wind, howled through the streets, ripping branches from old maples and hurling them into power lines. Sheets of rain hammered the pavement, overwhelming gutters and flooding the roads. Families huddled indoors, watching as flickers danced across their light bulbs, their faith placed in the new smart grid that had promised Crestwood a future free of blackouts. But technology, as Walter Bennett had always known, is only as good as the people who understand it. In the Utilities Control Center, Eric Cruz paced back and forth, eyes darting between the glowing monitors. Red warning signals lit up across the city grid map sector by sector. The system was failing. Substations overloaded transformers. Blue and critical backup systems were collapsing under the pressure. Why aren't the automated reroutes working? Eric demanded, his polished calm fracturing into panic. Madison Lee, the lead engineer, wiped rainwater from her jacket and pointed to the monitors. The AI doesn't recognize half of these connections. They weren't on the official blueprints. What do you mean they weren't on the blueprints? Eric snapped. Madison hesitated, then murmured, because they were built in the field. By Walter Bennett. Eric fell silent, his face pale. By 9 p.m. half the city was dark. Traffic signals blinked out. The hospital switched to emergency generators. Calls poured in from the fire department, police dispatch, and frantic residents. The smart grid, so confident in theory, was crumbling in practice. And no one on the night shift had the slightest idea how to navigate the undocumented maze of Crestwood's aging infrastructure. In the mayor's office, Susan Keller stood at the window, watching the storm lash the streets below. Her phone buzzed nonstop with updates, power failures rising, floodwaters stalled rescue efforts. She turned to her staff. Do we have anyone who knows the old system? A grim-faced assistant stepped forward. There's only one person. Susan didn't need to ask who. Within minutes, she was pulling on her raincoat, grabbing the partial blueprints, and stepping into the night. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Walter sat on his porch, a dim battery lantern casting a circle of light around his chair. He'd seen the flicker in his own house, the momentary tremble in the lines. He knew he always knew. So when headlights appeared through the downpour and the mayor's car skidded to a stop in his driveway, Walter wasn't surprised. What he didn't expect was to see Susan Keller herself sprint through the rain, blueprints clutched in her hands, hair plastered to her face, desperation written in every line of her body. And then in a gesture no one in Crestwood could have imagined, the mayor of the city knelt before a retired electrician on a rain-slick porch. Walter, she called out breathless, we need you. The mayor's knock was barely audible over the roar of the storm, but Walter Bennett was already at the door before her fist hit the wood. He had been waiting. Standing under the porch light, Mayor Susan Keller looked nothing like the polished leader Walter had seen on TV. Her coat clung to her in soaked folds. Her shoes were caked with mud, and her hands trembled as they clutched a bundle of wet, crumpled blueprints. Behind her, the city SUV idled in the driveway, its headlights casting long streaks of light across the rain-slick lawn. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Walter. Susan finally gasped, brushing drenched hair out of her face. We were wrong. We need you. Walter's face, lined with age and calm patience, gave no immediate reaction. His gaze drifted down to the blueprints in her hands, incomplete, water-streaked and useless without the knowledge stored in his head. The grid's collapsing, Susan went on, voice breaking. The hospital's about to lose backup. The AI can't read the old modifications. We can't find the grounding points you installed. Please. Walter stepped forward, his boots clicking softly on the wooden porch. He reached out and gently took the blueprints from her, shaking off some of the water. His eyes scanned the pages for no more than 10 seconds before he tapped a calloused finger on a junction point. Wrong grounding here, he murmured. You're pushing load onto a bypass that was only meant for emergencies. It's not the AI's fault. Whoever installed the upgrade didn't understand how the old system was balanced. Susan drew in a shaky breath, glancing back toward the car. Will you come with us? Walter stood silent for a beat, then reached behind the door and pulled down his old work coat. The same one he'd worn through hurricanes and snowstorms, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, the color faded from years in the sun. As he slipped it on, a quiet transformation seemed to pass over him. I'm coming, he said softly. Not for you, not for the city administration, but for the people who need power to live. As they rushed to the waiting SUV, Susan called ahead to the control center. We've got him, she shouted over the engine's hum. Keep your team ready. At the substation. The sight of Walter stepping out of the vehicle sent a ripple through the room. Young engineers stood frozen, some in awe, some in embarrassment at the way he had been pushed aside. Eric Cruz, pale and drawn, stepped forward but faltered as Walter passed him without a word. Walter moved through the space with practiced precision. He ran his fingers over panels, muttered to himself, and directed the team with short, clear instructions. Bring me a voltmeter. Pull up the secondary line schematic. Watch that ground resistance. She'll blow if we don't balance it right. For the first time in hours, order began to return. And in that moment, Crestwood's future and past worked side by side, not in competition, but in harmony. The Grant Avenue substation buzzed with frantic energy as Walter Bennett stepped inside the storm's howling wind, trailing in behind him. For a moment, the room froze. Young technicians stared at the old man in the doorway, gray-haired, weathered boots dripping with rain, the legendary figure they had once written off as a relic. Madison Lee, the lead engineer, rushed forward, relief flooding her face. Eric Cruz, pale and silent, hovered in the corner, his earlier confidence shattered. Walter didn't waste time on greetings. Show me the live readings, he said firmly. His eyes sweeping the room, Madison handed him a tablet, but Walter shook his head. Paper. If you've got it. Scrambling, the team printed the schematics. Walter bent over the sheets, his fingers tracing the lines like an old piano player, reacquainting himself with a familiar tune. You're routing power through the downtown bypass, he murmured almost to himself. That was temporary. I set it up years ago when we couldn't get state approval for a full upgrade. It's fine for light overflow, but under this load it'll collapse. You need to balance the east sector on the old ground loop. The room burst into motion at his words. Walter moved like a conductor at the center of an orchestra, issuing short, clear commands. He explained as he worked, not just barking orders, but teaching the younger techs as they followed. See this, he said, to Diego Morales, pointing to a junction box. It was never on the official map. We added it during the '98 expansion when we couldn't shut down the main line for repairs. The AI doesn't recognize it because no one documented it, but it's been carrying load for 2 decades. Diego, wide-eyed, nodded furiously and jotted down notes. Outside, rain pounded the pavement and the river swelled near the flood stage. Inside the control room, lights flickered on the grid monitor. First yellow, then steady green as circuits came back online. Madison radioed the hospital power, stabilizing in 5, 4, 3. In the background, Walter heard the crackle of the fire department radio, the murmur of dispatch, coordinating rescues, and the faint cheer from city workers in the field as streetlights blinked back to life. At 11:23 p.m., the hospital called in backup generator off primary power stable. The control room erupted in applause, engineers high-fiving a few, wiping tears of relief. Walter stood quietly off to the side, rolling a worn pencil between his fingers, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Eric Cruz approached him hesitantly, his polished demeanor crumbling. Walter? Walter raised a hand, gently stopping him. No speeches, son, just learn from this. In that storm-battered room, something remarkable had happened. Not just the saving of a city, but the mending of a bridge between generations. For one unforgettable night, wisdom and innovation had stood shoulder to shoulder, proving that progress and experience were not enemies but partners. And Walter, the man they once cast aside, had quietly, humbly become the hero. Crestwood would never forget. Morning came slowly to Crestwood. The storm had passed, leaving the streets strewn with broken branches, puddles glimmering under a pale sunrise, and residents blinking into the daylight as they stepped outside to assess the damage. But the most important thing was that the lights were on. In the control center, the exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Crumpled coffee cups, damp raincoats draped over chairs, the glow of monitors still running status checks. And amid it all, Walter Bennett stood quietly near the window, watching as the city stirred back to life. News of what had happened spread fast. By noon, social media feeds were flooded with photos. Walter at the substation, the soaked mayor at his doorstep, the city blinking back to life block by block. Headlines ran, "Retired electrician saves," "Crestwood and forgotten hero, restores a city in crisis." But Walter, as always, had no interest in the spotlight. He was about to slip out when Mayor Susan Keller caught up to him. Walter, please, we want to recognize you, she said, her voice warm but insistent. The council's planning a special session. You saved this city. Walter gave a small shake of his head. I don't need a plaque, Susan. But she placed a hand on his shoulder. Do it for them, she said, nodding toward the younger techs watching him from across the room. Admiration written plainly on their faces. A week later, the council chamber was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, and residents filled every seat. Eric Cruz sat near the front, humbled and thoughtful, while Madison Lee and Diego Morales flanked Walter, as if they were guarding him from the fuss. Mayor Keller took the podium, delivering a short, graceful speech. She spoke of Walter's decades of service, his knowledge, his sacrifice, and most of all, his willingness to return when the city called. When it was Walter's turn, he rose, awkwardly adjusted his old jacket and faced the crowd. I only have one request. Walter said, his voice rough but steady. Hang the original maps in the technical department, the ones with the handwritten notes. Not for me, for the next generation. So they remember that before the computers, before the dashboards, someone drew this city's lifelines by hand. For a moment there was silence. Then the applause came, building slowly rolling through the chamber like a wave. Madison gave him a quiet, proud nod. Diego grinned ear to ear. In the weeks that followed, Walter returned not as an employee, but as a mentor. He worked side by side with the young technicians, walking them through the old systems, showing them how to balance experience with innovation. The framed maps now hung prominently in the department, a daily reminder of the man who had once saved the city when no algorithm could. And for Walter, something unexpected had happened. He had found a new purpose, not in keeping the lights on, but in passing on the wisdom to ensure they never went dark again. Walter Bennett never saw himself as a hero. He was, in his own words, just a man who kept the lights on. But in the weeks following the storm, Crestwood saw him as something more, a reminder that progress isn't just about faster systems or sleeker tools, but about the wisdom that teaches us how to use them. As reporters drifted away and city life returned to normal, Walter eased back into his quiet routines. He still woke early, still sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, still tended his small garden. But now his days held something new. Every few afternoons, Walter could be found at the utilities department, standing among a group of young technicians. They'd lean in, listening intently as he explained why the east sector was wired a certain way, or how the bypass in the industrial park had been installed during an emergency in the 90s. Sometimes he brought his old battered notebook, its pages, yellowed corners, curled, and laid it next to their tablets and laptops. For Walter, the work had never been about bosses, paychecks, or titles, as he once told Diego Morales. It's for the mother warming a bottle at 2 a.m., the grandfather on oxygen, the child scared of the dark. It's about making sure that when they flip that switch, something happens on the other end. That was the heart of Walter's life, quiet, invisible service. Crestwood had been so eager to leap into the future that it nearly erased the wisdom of the past. But the storm had taught them an unforgettable lesson. The city's digital systems were brilliant, fast, and precise, but they had gaps, blind spots, places where only human hands and memories could reach. Walter became a living bridge between two eras, analog and digital, old school and new wave. Word of his work spread. Schools began sending students on field trips to the utilities department, where they learned not only about smart grids and AI, but also about the original maps, the hand-drawn ones now displayed in a glass case on the main wall. Teachers spoke of Walter Bennett as an example of resilience, humility, and service. Walter never chased recognition, but sometimes at the grocery store or walking downtown, someone would stop him and say, "Thank you for what you did." And Walter, always humble, would tip his cap and reply, "Just doing my part." In a world racing toward automation, Walter reminded Crestwood, and anyone willing to listen, that human wisdom is not replaceable. Machines can process data, but only experience teaches judgment. Algorithms can predict patterns, but only people understand consequences. Walter's legacy wasn't just in the power lines he repaired or the blueprints he memorized. It lived in the people he trained, the lessons he passed on, and the quiet truth he embodied. Progress and tradition don't have to compete. Together they light the way forward. As we look back on Walter Bennett's story, we realize it's not just about one man saving a city, It's about the lessons we so often overlook in today's fast-moving world. We live in an age where technology evolves faster than we can keep up, where apps promise to fix everything, and AI promises to know what we need. But Walter reminds us that there are things only human experience can teach: the wisdom of patience, the value of hands-on learning, and the importance of knowing not just the system, but the people you're serving. For older adults, watching Walter's story may feel familiar, a reminder of a time when loyalty, craftsmanship, and quiet service were honored, not dismissed. For younger viewers, it's an invitation to reflect. Are we listening to the voices that came before us, or are we rushing ahead without learning from their hard-won experience? And here's where we'd love to hear from you. What did Walter's story make you think about? Have you seen a time when older wisdom saved the day in your life, family, or community? Do you think modern America values experience enough, or are we too quick to replace the old with the new? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories, insights, or even disagreements. Let's open a conversation that bridges generations. Thank you for spending time with us today and listening to this remarkable story. If you found it meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who'd appreciate it. Together, let's keep these stories and their lessons alive for future generations.